How can government, how can this government begin to understand or think they know more or know better of what First Nations are talking about when it comes to treaty?
Tonight, First Nations say a new bill passed in Saskatchewan violates their treaty rights.
When I think of it in those terms, I think it's not completely systemic.
Plus, it's Brenda Lucky's last day as head of the RCMP.
All but 3 of them are dead, and so I think this is low in terms of risk for the Jesuits.
And our Truth and Politics panel gives their take on Jesuits priests accused of sexual misconduct. Good evening, Tanse Anine. Welcome to APTN National News. I'm Daryl Stranger. It's called the Saskatchewan First Act, or Bill 88, and it's an attempt by the Saskatchewan government to strengthen its control over the province's natural resources. But Indigenous groups are rallying against the new legislation, saying it threatens inherent treaty rights. APTN's Fraser Needham has more.
Bill 88 passed third reading on Thursday, but not without opposition from the NDP.
No!
And a number of Indigenous organizations who traveled to the legislature in Regina. The government made amendments that say the act will not lessen existing treaty rights as defined in the Constitution, but Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations Chief Bobby Cameron says this isn't good enough.
We have treaty experts, we have elders, knowledge keepers, chiefs, counselors, grassroots people that have all reached out to us and stated the same thing. The Saskatchewan First Act impacts our inherent treaty rights. How can this government begin to understand or think they know more or know better of what First Nations are talking about when it comes to treaty? They don't.
The Métis Nation of Saskatchewan is also against the legislation. Vice President Michelle Leclerc says claims by the government that it consulted with Indigenous groups before passing the bill are simply untrue.
Number one, we weren't consulted. Number two, there was an introduction into the House that First Nations and Métis be able to speak to committee about the constitutionality of the act. That was denied by committee and denied by the Saskatchewan government. So there's a lot of problems with respect to the Saskatchewan First Act. And the number one problem is the consultation.
Cameron says the FSN will use every means possible to prevent the government from utilizing Bill 88.
So now we're on this course to take legal action. We have many First Nations who are coordinating. Obviously, we're going to exhaust every avenue politically, legally, technically. And in the end, when our First Nations are ready to put up blockades to protect our lands and waters and our resources, then we're going to do so.
And Leclerc says the MNS is also exploring legal options to challenge the legislation.
We see it as unconstitutional with respect to Section 25 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, with respect to Section 35 of the Constitution Act.
Fraser Needham, APTN National News, Ottawa.
Well, despite their band being dismantled by the federal government in the 1950s, former members and descendants of the Pelly Banks band are continuing to assert their traditional rights. In this final part of our coverage on the Pelly Banks people, our reporter Sarah Connors shows us the issues they face as an unrecognized First Nation.
Is that one the old trail, Dad, or is this the old trail?
The land has always been important to Pelly Banks member Harold Smith and his daughter-in-law, Erica Gilson. But as an unrecognized First Nations government, the Pelly Banks people aren't eligible for funding and have little say on what goes on in their traditional territory. One particular sore point, the Kutzakaya mine. The proposed open pit project would primarily mine silver and zinc.
We're the closest to where that mine is going to go in. We have a home that's built like 10 kilometers from where they're proposing this mine.
Pelly Banks was not included as one of the impacted Kaska First Nations in a 2022 decision document regarding the proposed mine.
Pelly Banks has never been brought to the table. Yet it's on our doorstep.
That's why Pelly Banks wants to be recognized as its own First Nation. Their people say they were wrongfully amalgamated with another band in the 1950s and want to be reinstated. In the Yukon, 2 formerly amalgamated bands have since separated to form their own First Nations.
The Indian Act so far really divided our people.
Pelly Banks Crow Clan chief Tesloa Smith says the only option for his people's reinstatement is Section 17 of the Indian Act. That would mean Pelly Banks would have to be recognized as a new band.
And we keep saying to the government that we're not a new band, we're a band all along with our leaders intact.
Smith says if reinstated, the band would also fall under the Indian Act and their assets would be divided with Ross River. But he argues other Kaska First Nations funding and services should not be impacted.
We're still trying to pursue that, but in a way that we want it as a traditional government rather than the Indian Act. But they're always pushing that Section 17 to us.
The federal government's been very clear about no new monies, whether it's for new treaties, new negotiations, or anything.
Gabrielle Slowey is an associate professor in the Department of Politics at York University, where she teaches courses in Indigenous and Arctic politics. She says Section 17 appears to put the onus back on the community to do the work of reinstatement.
The federal government now has created sort of this pathway that, again, as you said, puts the onus back on the communities, sort of like, okay, we created the problem, you guys figure it out.
Last year, the federal government gave Pelly Banks a small amount of funding to hire a researcher to help them produce historical record documentation. Gilson says while the funding isn't nearly enough, it's a positive sign Canada is recognizing the harm it's caused.
However, it's a big step, and it's a step that was missing for 73 years.
While their band might be forgotten by the federal government, Gilson says the Pelly Banks people won't stop fighting until they're rightfully recognized.
The biggest message that we could give the world today is that we're still here. We're still alive. We're still on our land, walking our trails that were here thousands of years before any government ever came here and told us whether we have the right to exist or not. Who are they to tell us that we have the right to exist or not?
Sarah Connors, APTN National News, Pelly Banks.
It's great work by Sarah there. Today is Brenda Lucky's last day on the job as the RCMP Commissioner, and the federal government has announced her temporary replacement. Public Safety Minister Marco Mendicino announced that Deputy RCMP Commissioner Mike Duhem will take on the role of interim commissioner starting tomorrow. He will serve until a new permanent leader can be appointed. Mendicino also thanked Lucky for her service. Lucky announced her retirement after 5 tumultuous years as Canada's top cop, which saw her grapple with a number of issues like the Freedom Convoy protests and the 2020 Nova Scotia mass shooting. She also faced scrutiny over allegations of systemic racism in the RCMP. Here she is speaking to that issue in 2020.
When I think of it in those terms, I think it's not completely systemic. But then when I think of it in terms of unconscious bias, I think we're not immune to that. And there is unconscious bias in our organization. And we work hard to work through it.
All right, we have to step aside a moment here, but more news is still to come. Welcome back. The Jesuits of Canada released a list of 27 priests who were accused of sexually abusing children over the past 70 years. The Catholic order called the allegations, quote, credible. For more on this, Dennis Ward is joined by our Truth and Politics panelists.
Carrie Negon, always great to have you with us. First question to you, Carrie. The Jesuit order has named 27 of its members as being credibly accused of sexual assault against children. What do you make of that as somebody who attended one of these so-called schools?
I think that's a low number, considering how long the Jesuits have been operating and how long these accusations have been floating. So I think the number is low, but I appreciate that they did fulfill their promise to release the names.
Negon, your thoughts on names being released?
All but 3 of them are dead. And so I think this is low in terms of risk for the Jesuits. We have to remember that, there are about 200 current active Jesuits. It's an all-male order across the country, 200 today, and that this is a big footprint within Indigenous communities, and particularly that the Catholic Church and the Jesuits have a very big impact. And so absolutely that it is a low risk to name these names. So on one level, good for them that they're stepping up and that they're releasing these names so that people can be accountable, and also that survivors can be seen and recognized for their experiences. But I, like Carrie, totally agree. There is undoubtedly much more, and it's a matter of how do we begin to believe survivors, support them, and then also bring other members to justice when needed. And not all communities want individuals to be named as well, to work with Indigenous communities to make sure that there's also privacy considerations.
To Negon's point there, Carrie, is this a little too late, as most of them that were named are now long gone?
Too late to get any sort of accountability. I think it's not too late in terms of validating existing survivors. There's always that idea that, oh, that didn't happen because there's no names. And so now we have concrete proof. There's names, there's actual people associated who committed these crimes and verified. So there is some sort of I'm lost for words right now.
Carrie, Negon touched on this as well, and we did in an interview with the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation earlier this week too. Should there be more, consultation, and we don't know how much there was this time around, leading up to the release of these names with survivors?
Well, absolutely. There's an ethical obligation to those who have been harmed. 100% they should be at the center of the release of these names. And then also, what is the accountability of the Jesuit order, and particularly the Catholic Church, in relation to rebuilding these lives, rebuilding these communities? It's only a short while back that we heard about the secret deal that the Catholic Church brokered with the Stephen Harper government back way before when they were legally mandated to compensate survivors tens of millions of dollars, and brokered a deal to pay much less than that. So we know that the Catholic Church needs to participate within the healing of communities, but survivors must be at the center, particularly when a news release comes like this, because people are triggered. People are facing trauma, and when you hear about even the perpetrator of harm's name, people oftentimes go into crisis as a result.
Carrie, your thoughts on centering this around survivors before naming these names?
I think survivors should be the center of it. Like, they're the ones that are dealing with the trauma. They're the ones that are still, their families are still dealing with everything that happened to them in these schools. Intergenerational trauma is very real. And I agree with Negon, having these names just suddenly released and not having, being prepared. As somebody who's gone through the residential school system and having parents who've been survivors and dealing with all of that, it brings back a lot of emotion, especially, well, for me. I'm not sure how my mother will feel. I'm sure she's triggered.
Carrie, do you think this might lead the way for other Catholic orders to start naming names?
I hope so. I really hope so. If they set an example, then it's not so scary anymore. Like they've already set precedent, so why not? Why not name them?
Niigaan, despite the fact that many of these people have passed on, what do you think might come from this, the release of the names?
Well, I hope that Canadians, and the question is whether Canadians are paying attention to this story or not. Yeah. I hope that Canadians pay attention, because there is still a great deal of doubt out there about the harms that happened predominantly in Catholic-run schools, who run the majority of residential schools, and that the doubt amongst Canadians is often fostered by denialists and so on, who say terrible things and incorrect statements around residential schools, and saying things like, oh, the schools weren't that bad, and oh, the unmarked graves aren't really unmarked graves, and so on. I hope that Canadians pay attention to this story to see that the atrocities that are perpetrated within those schools, this 27 names that are released, are just a tip of a very big iceberg. And it's something in which there's under the surface of these names is a great deal of other systemic abuses that the Catholic Church was involved in. And much of that involved the death and the harm of children. And I hope that those who are watching also take good care of yourself. That I know a day like this is very triggering, and that you surround yourself with family and your spiritual supports to make sure that you're cared for.
Absolutely. Carrie, Niigaan, we'll leave it there, but always great to hear from you.
Amy Glitch.
The National Indian Residential School Crisis Line is available for survivors and others who might need support. That number is 1-866-925-4419. And you can look forward to the Truth in Politics panel on a weekly basis, discussing whatever it is the week brings us. All right, we have to take one more short pause here. Photo of the day and weather are next. Welcome back. It's time now for our photo of the day. Happy St. Patrick's Day from Miss Adeline, who was always dressed for the occasion. Adeline would also like to wish a happy birthday to her grandma. Thanks to Kelsey Weber for the photo, and thank you, Miss Adeline. For the chance to be our next photo of the day, you can send your photos to share@aptn.ca. All right, now let's take a look at tomorrow's weather forecast. We start on the East Coast. We got 2 degrees in St. John's and 5 in Charlottetown. -3 in Cartwright and -13 in Coujawak. 3 degrees in Quebec City and 2 in Montreal. -1 in snow in Toronto and -2 in snow in North Bay. -10 in snow in Timmins and -5 in Sioux Lookout. In Churchill, -8 in snow and -5 in snow in God's Lake. -1 in clear in Barons River and clear in -7 in Winnipeg. -6 in Regina and -3 in Saskatoon. 2 degrees in Buffalo Narrows and clear, and in Stony Rapids, -1. As we head west, 3 degrees in Fort Chippewa and -1 in clear in Peace River. 4 degrees in Edmonton and 11 in Lethbridge. 14 in Vancouver and 14 in Bella Coola. 11 in Prince Rupert and 6 in clear in Fort Nelson. 3 degrees in Dawson and 5 in Whitehorse. -8 in Norman Wells and clear and +5 in Trout Lake. -11 in Inuvik and -9 in Colville Lake. -19 in Baker Lake and snow and -16 in Arvit. -26 in Arctic Bay and clear and -22 in Iqaluit. In the second of a 4-part series, Inside Corrections, APTN Investigates video journalist Rob Smith traveled to Archambault Prison in Quebec to speak to inmate John Derek Mills. He's been in prison nearly 3 decades despite being eligible for parole 20 years ago. Rob joins us now to talk about the episode Hard Time. Rob, thanks so much for joining us here. Can you tell us a bit of who is John Derek Mills?
John Derek Mills is a 56-year-old Cree man from Saskatchewan. He's currently doing his time in Archambault Prison in Quebec for a botched armed robbery and kidnapping committed back in 1996.
So, Rob, why feature his story in this correction series?
Well, we're taking a 30,000 look view at corrections, and Mills kind of fit the mold of somebody who kind of hits every misuse of the justice system all the way through from when he was a child until his recent incarceration. His story is a wild story. It's a story of police chase through Vancouver streets, went for 30 blocks. He was convicted of kidnapping. He says that he did not do a kidnapping, did not put a little child that he was carrying with him in harm's way. He wants a new trial. So his story was compelling, if somewhat, amazing and unbelievable at the same time. And so we thought that would be a good thing to match his story with the broader picture of what's happening with corrections.
Well, Rob, you mentioned he wants a new trial. So what is next here for John Derek Mills?
He freely admits that he has nothing to go on right now. He has a parole hearing coming up in April. However, for that to be successful, he's going to have to admit to this kidnapping. He admits to everything else that happened that night during this police chase. Gunshots were fired. But he will not admit to kidnapping the child. He maintains that he was just trying to get her out of the situation, protect her from harm. So the parole probably will not go his way. And he says there are people who would take up, organizations out there have talked to him that would take up his case to try to get a new trial, but he needs new evidence. And so that's where it stands right now.
All right, Rob, certainly look forward to your piece. Thanks so much for this.
No problem. Thank you.
You can catch Hard Time, the second in a 4-part series, Inside Corrections, on APTN Investigates, coming up right after the news. And the stardom of a Soto model from Saskatchewan may be growing, but the 18-year-old is staying grounded with trips back home to Fishing Lake First Nation. APTN's Leanne Sanders has more.
This photo shows Heather Diamond Strongarm on a recent trip home. Here she's ice fishing in a Treaty 4 territory derby. And this was her just a few short days later, wearing Versace on the runway. a rooftop in Los Angeles. She may have just turned 18 in Milan, but she's becoming very familiar with the runways, hitting 10 or more and being named one of Vogue's 10 standout models of fall 2023. Diamond Strongarm also made history as the first Indigenous model to open a runway show for Dior, something she had dreamed of doing.
After the casting, they sent me straight to fitting, and then they made me try on the outfit for like the first look that opens the show, and then they're like, yeah, you're gonna open the show. And I was like, I was shocked. It was an amazing opportunity.
2 years ago, she went to a modeling workshop on her home reserve. A contract with Toronto's Anita Norris Models soon followed, and then the Society Management in New York scouted her. Diamond Strongarm is not new to the spotlight, though, dancing at powwows in a jingle dress.
Yeah, I make my own regalia. I make my own moccasins, like hair ties, beadwork. I haven't tried making a dress or anything yet, but I'm gonna try to do that soon. I make ribbon skirts though.
With all her jet setting, Diamond Strongarm comes home to recharge.
My comfort foods, it's just like flour soup with like bannock. I eat a lot of soup whenever I come home. I feel very really refreshed and recharged whenever I come back and visit family, because whenever I'm away from home, I feel really homesick and start missing my family, just everything, or else miss being in my reservation.
Leanne Sanders, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
Well, we certainly wish her the best of luck wherever her career takes her. All right, that's all we have on this St. Patrick's Day Friday of APTN National News. I'm Daryl Stranger. For all of us here, thank you so much for joining us, and have a great night.